in chapter 8, and dealing with proportional systems to grid and brochure design. So it's going to really go in and we're going to start to build off of dealings with compositions. So with this, we're going to start to look at the mathematical ratios and proportional systems. As you go in and start to work with stuff, once you understand how that works, once you start to think about grids and use grids, what you're going to find is that designing everything gets easier. Early on, you may want to choose a specific grid and just stick to it. So we go through and start to think about what's happening with proportional systems and grids. They've been around forever. Go back to ancient Greece and we start dealing with that. Artists, the architects, anything that's been constructed goes through and starts to really work off of proportions, and also we even get to the sense that ideal proportions when we start dealing with facial structures, body structures that are there. And then we're also going to look at then how do we play with it, how to get used into it. Music goes through and uses mathematics. So how many beats end up in there? Are we on a 4/4? What are we working off of? So start to think about how is this stuff going to play into your designs. The big thing we get into proportion, how does size actually play into what is happening? So this really is just, when we start talking about proportions, it's the relationships that two objects have to one another. As we begin to work with proportions and placements, and that play into the aesthetics, once we put those things together, that's how we end up then with a harmonious relationship and a finished composition. So as we go through, we start to build it. Music is one place we always go back to. We start talking about discord. If you play notes that don't play with each other, there's no harmony to it, it's uneasy. If we create a design that is not harmonious, it's uneasy, can be uneasy for a reader to look at. That can be intentional, that can be unintentional. When we start talking about harmony within this is the agreement that we have inside of the composition. How do they actually work with each other? Do they support each other? Do they fight each other? If we have something that is in harmony, then they essentially are looking at the sense that they are perfectly beautiful objects that we have then there that are found then playing with each other versus fighting with each other. So we go to Fibonacci numbers. So Leonardo Pisa. So with that, he was known as Fibonacci. It's just going in to start to deal with what do we have for the proportions on this. So we go into the golden ratio. Is another term that you will hear stated as well. So, and that's going to be your 1.618 as we go through and start to look at the numbers. Now, where does this come from? Well, if we go and we start to look at the shapes, they really come from Fibonacci spiral. So if we go through and we start to look at this, think of the Nautilus shell. Look familiar? So we go through and start to look at it. How does this go through and work with it? Well, we start to think about how they build, and I'll jump back here. So we have our first square, and then of course if we come out from that, we go into our second one. So there's our 1, 1. When those come together, we get to our 2. You'll see then 1, 2 carries over. The line comes through into 3. 2, 3 takes up 5. 3, 5 carries over to 8. And this continues to grow and grow and grow and grow based upon that 1.618, which is your golden proportion. So here it is in a Fibonacci spiral, so you can see what's happening down here as it begins to move through our shapes. So we build out from the first one, working its way out, continuing to expand up, so we can see what's happening with the size on here. So you'll see that if we go through and we start to work with a format, we start to deal with the screen. So what we have on here is we have an 8 tall and a 13 wide. So if we go through and we start to build that, that's going to allow us to continue to play with what we have as a golden proportion. As you start to compare that, that's just your A value, height, versus your width value, your B. So as you start to think with things, if you want things to have that perfect proportion, that's where you go off of, 1.618. So if it's 1 inch tall, 1.618 wide, you're right there in the golden proportion. Or golden ratio, 1 to 1.618. So there's the golden ratio, and we go and start to talk about it. So we look at is our phi. So with that, dealing with the letter F, Greek letter. So it's really looking at the relationship. We're looking at A and B. So if you're looking at what you're building, that's one rule that we can go through and we can work with. Another rule we can come into is our rule of thirds. Now the goal of our rule of thirds, and we've talked about this in other lessons, is to go in and get the placement away from the center line. So yes, it's in relation to the center line, but we want to discourage us from simply going in and putting a design that splits the page in half. So what we have is we have these different points in here as we start to work with our rule of thirds, where these different lines then intersect. So we can start to think about the lines, the horizontal lines. If you want to go through and begin to set it up, you can put the horizon line on that bottom line then. Start to think about where we're placing objects that are going to hit on those individual points that are on there. Those focal points at the intersection is where we're going to push for. A lot of times I hear those referred to, and I've referred to them before, as those PowerPoints. Those are the areas on the page that we want to put them at, because then we're going to have power on the page versus going in and just placing things in the center. If you have a person that's on there that's looking a direction, allowing them to look through the composition is of course going to help keep us engaged in the composition. If you put them facing, if they're over here on the far right and they're facing to the right, they're going to help push us out of it. If they're facing back to the left, it's going to allow us to look back in and push us back into what we have as our composition. Now, as we get into modularity, so modularity is just simply going to go into, it's a structural principle that allows us to go in and subdivide a format into what we consider to be manageable segments. So we're just moving things into modules so we can go ahead and say, all right, this is where we're going to begin to place things. The module then is all self-contained. It is fixed. It's a fixed unit that when we combine them together, creates a larger foundational structure and allows us to go in and start to think about allowing these things to continue to work together to create these larger regular units. So these are some examples that we can go in and we can start to look at modularity. We can start to look at each module that's here. How can we go in and work with these modules, combine these modules to allow us to have a consistent layout and design. We get into chunking. So chunking is where we really go in. It's related to modularity in design, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to split things into groups. So our goal here is to take these and put them into digestible amounts of information. So you can look at it and say, okay, this stuff is related. I'm going to need to focus onto this. These are related. Let's focus onto these. So we go through and we start to look at information like business cards. We look at business information and we look at your information. Your information is chunked over so that we have your name, your title, your contact information. Grids. Get used to using grids, especially early on. It will help you lay things out much faster. As you start to build a grid in certain applications, you can save that grid and you can just apply it immediately to your documents. And as you apply that grid into there, what will happen with that is that it's going to allow you to place things much faster. So we start looking at our grid. It's just a structure. It's made up of vertical lines and horizontal lines. Those allow us to go in and build those modules that we just talked about. It also is going to start to work when we start dealing with text as columns. It's going to automatically help set up where your margins are on the page. This is going to greatly assist you in the organization of your type and images. Again, the two things that we put inside of any design. The other thing that we have with the grid is it's going to go ahead and it's going to establish to us that structure. So that structure that's going to be there. We're going to see it's there. We're going to understand it's there. It also is going to go back to when we talked about harmony. When you start placing things in consistent measures throughout the designs, what's going to happen is it's going to help us have visual consistency as we move from page to page. We know where we expect to see things. All of us like to know where things are at. It makes us comfortable as we go through and start to look at things, read things, understand things. So if you go through and start to use the grid, that's what's going to happen. The other thing is when we get into multi-page. It's good to have that grid on a single static page, but it also when we get into multi-page and we get consistency from page to page to page. So we start looking at modular grids. These are all built, these pages, on the same actual grid that is there. So you can start to see how are we working with those modules. What do we have for our gutters? This will help you place things. If you're someone who struggles saying, I don't know how to put things on the page, choose a grid. Choose an existing grid. And then just use it. The more you use it, the better you're ultimately going to get with it. There are single column grids out there. You see these referred to as manuscript grids. With it, you figure out what your margins are, and everything goes into one single column of copy. This is the most basic page structure. Every single one of you in here has used this. 100% guaranteed. State my salary for the rest of my life on it. Everybody in this classroom has used a manuscript grid before. Now we get into working in magazines. There's a few different grids that you'll see inside of there. You'll see our 1 column, see a 2 column, and then 4 columns. Those are going to be your most common ones that you'll see as you get into your magazines. Don't be afraid as you start designing, dealing with brochures, anything else, work with one of these. Get comfortable with it. What's going to happen when we go through and work with it? All we're doing is we're actually creating our pool lanes. So what you see on here on the left, people swimming in a pool. There are multiple people in lanes, but they're all going in the same direction on above and below. So we know where things are at. We want to know where things are. We see on the other one looks completely chaotic. To me, I look at that one, I wonder how many of them are drowning right now. Because there's just no structure to it. It's a whole different setting as you look at the two, what's going on there. So we want to actually keep things in their lanes. Now we get into our grid. What is our grid anatomy? Well, remember we talked about the module. So you're going to see there on the upper left of the right image there, that orange area, that is a module. Module is formed by the horizontal and vertical lines. As we go through and we group them together, we end up with spatial zones. That's the blue area you see on there. And then you start to see with the additional green that's there how we can go through and create additional zones based upon what's inside of that grid. We start looking at our margins. Our margins are still here. Remember, everything's designed in relation to the margin. So we see on the outside, that's our margin area. Any of our vertical areas that we group together are our columns. So we can go through, we can use that for text. We can also deal with a large rectangular design that falls inside of there. And then when we look at our horizontal modules together on there, that's going to go ahead and put us into a row. Once again, we can still use that for headings, use that for images. But you can see very quickly as we start to look at what is here. The line that's going to go directly on the bottom part of any of the images, that's our flow line. It's allowing us to go through as we read it. How do we go through and see through the page? So start to think about how do we use those, and then the space that we have between each of our modules, those help us for legibility purposes. So kind of think of those as like a return, so we can use that space. Once we get to the end, we carry that white space or the negative space down over to the next area that we want to go into. This will greatly assist you in laying things out. Now you have the option to dedicate columns in areas to text. Also you have those to dedicate to images, and inside the images a lot of times captions are going to be embedded inside of what you have for the image itself. We go through, we start looking at a baseline grid. Now what is a baseline grid? Anytime we go through and we place text, text is not automatically aligned to a baseline grid. We start working in InDesign. If you worked in InDesign, you have the ability, and there's a little checkbox that says to align things to baseline grid. So what that's going to do is you define how large the grid is all the way across your document. And you'll notice that all of the text, regardless of where it's at, regardless of the size, is going to sit on that baseline grid. Keep in mind as you go through and build that baseline grid and you make these things on the baseline grid, that if we have larger text, of course it's sitting on that same baseline grid as smaller text. So when we use smaller text on a baseline grid, it's going to increase the leading. That's because it's not using that leading value of the text that you had defined on there. It's going to be using the leading value based upon the baseline grid. This is another structure that allows us to go in and align the text in a sense that we have a recognized repeatable distance between baselines. Modular grids, I said, use them, play with them, work with them, understand what you can do with them. Notice that these 2 pages, however, being completely different in the way that we've actually gone in and chosen to put the items inside of here, we have consistency because they all have that same underlying structure. So in order to achieve better identification and financial savings through standardization of every aspect of the publications program, we designed a modular system that determined everything from the paper size to the graphics to cartography and illustration. Massimo Pignelli is the one that this is from. He used the Unigrid for everything. This is a sense where he chose it, he worked with it, he knew it inside and out, and then used that as he went in and began to design the different pieces that he's worked on. So you can choose that. Another thing, Helvetica is one of the big things that you use as well. So where you can take all of this stuff then is if we move into something like brochure design. So brochure design is actually one of the most widely used and most versatile multi-page graphic design formats that you're going to do. Because we start thinking about brochures, they're not only print, they're also designed then for on-screen purposes. Brochures are typically part of a much, much larger information program as we begin to pass it out. We begin to put these elements in there for us. So as we go through, we start to think about our brochure design. What is it that we want our audience to know? What is it that we're ultimately going in there and attempting to present? The brochure actually comes in and becomes a piece, a small piece of the rest of the campaign. So start to think about why are you actually having these communications? What is it you're trying to say? What is it you're trying to show? How is it going to carry itself out? So we start to look at, in this case, this is integrated branding for IAsiaWorks. So we start to look at the graphic. Well, how is it going to play into format? How many pages do we have inside of the brochure? What are the colors we're going to use? And then when we put all the pieces together, which we have in the upper right here, we put all these pieces together, how are they going to look as an overall unit? So when we get into the design, we need to go in and start to think about these 5 considerations. So how's the brochure system going to actually work with any of the stuff that's currently existing inside of the visual identity system? What type of content are we going to have inside of it? How are we going to go about communicating that content? Copy-driven, image-driven. How are the actual brochures going to function in context? When we start to think about this, how are we distributing them? Where are they going to be seen at? How are they going to be used? And then budget always plays into it. What's your budget? What do you have for paper? How many colors do you have available to you? Are there any special things that you can do with it? Die cuts, special printing processes, foils, going in and dealing with different printing processes that we have available as well, such as varnishes. We're going to do process colors because we have to use CMYK because we can't go through because it's going to be 16 different spot colors. So all those things start to go into what is there. How are you going to be using text and images? Are they going to be combined in every panel? Things dedicated only to text, some only to images. What is the grid that you're using for flexibility purposes? How is it going to play through those? Think about rhythm and pacing as you start to move through the brochure. What is it we want to see? Image, person, image, person, image, person. Do we continue that all the way through it? As we go through and we start to design the panels, think about flow. How do we move through each panel? And then at the end of the panel, how do we naturally flow into what is the next panel? We want to go through and start to think about type. Do we have family of type? How much flexibility do we have with that type? How are we going to use them throughout the designs to allow it to go through and be unified? And then also how are we going to go in and start to think about contrast between panel and panel to to allow them to go together so that they don't appear as though they are separate entities. Now we go and we start designing and working on a brochure system. There needs to be enough difference amongst brochures. So when you're working inside of a corporation, they can't all look the same. There has to be differentiation in those. What are you going to do with them? Again, consistency and differentiation. It could be something as simple as changes in colors for the fronts of them. How you work with the images on the fronts of them. So think about what you're going to do with that, because you're going to be working for a company. You may have 15 different brochures talking about, if you're working in a medical place, just different illnesses. But there needs to be consistency across them, but yet enough differentiation that you know which one you're grabbing. The other thing as we start to look at the system is know that each one needs to be able to stand alone, function on its own, do everything on its own, but also still work along with the rest of them. And lastly, as we dig into it, go back into there and start to think about how are we working with that system and the chunking of information to help us understand and better see what it is that is in there.